So it's another weekend for Warzone. Now, whether or not you finished off your battle pass, you hit max prestige on the season or not, this is the final weekend for season 2, meaning that this time next week, the world of Caldera will be changed. In some locations pretty greatly, others not so much. But given it's another weekend, I wanted to close out the season with our recently introduced sort of tradition here on the channel, another loadout video to help you navigate the best possible builds on your weaponry to dominate Warzone if you jump in for one final time this season. We've talked about the main meta, the fastest TTK weapons, the best weapons for rebirth, and recently the close range meta, so I figured let's flip that a little bit. Let's talk about the best weapons to fry your enemies and provide you the most firepower from mid to long range. 30 meters and out, this will have you covered. Today we're running down the top 10 builds for your long range to help you out in your everyday gameplay. As we go along, feel free to drop your preferred long range loadout because by no means is this a definitive list. The nice part about Warzone as of late is that there's a plenty of number of diamonds in the rough. Plenty of weapons that can do well even if it doesn't pop up on this list. But if you got a favorite, feel free to share with the community. We're all just trying to do our best here. If you enjoy the video, you find it at all insightful, do me a favor and drop a like on it. And if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button to stay up to date with all things loadouts, tips and tricks, and of course, a ton of season 3 content here coming in the near future. And finally, my friends over at G Fuel have bumped up code Espresso to 30% off your entire order in anticipation of season 3. So if you need a restock, want to try anything out for the very first time, now is as best a time as any. If you're looking for some great picks, hype sauce, pink drip, starfruit, strawberry banana, that new Morbius flavor, which is like a nectarine flavor, those are some of my favorites right now, probably my top 5, but highly recommend all those. If you're interested, check the link in the description below and use code Espresso for an added discount. But that said, let's jump into it. Firstly, a little disclaimer before we get into the builds themselves. As always, when we look at these top 10s, weapons will vary depending on situation. So I don't want to approach like a clear-cut, this is number 1, this is number 10, but instead just list off what I feel are the top 10 best long-range weapons to rock. So for that, we can kind of start familiar, breeze through some of these early on, and also, almost forgot to mention, some of this footage was recorded during the most recent Totally Normal BR playlist that was around for like 12 hours the other day. So if you see me launching myself in the air or my teammates doing that, just know that it's from an LTM. It was a ton of fun, couldn't pass up recording during it. Starting familiar though, let's jump in with the XM4. One of my favorites to use as of recently. There's like 3 weapons here that we'll start with that I think are very similar. It just comes down to what you want to get out of the weapon itself. The XM4 though is a weapon that is phenomenal. It's got great control, it's got nice handling, but it doesn't pack as much a punch as the next 2 weapons we'll talk about, but it's still phenomenal for your long range play and is something that is an awesome choice here when you look at viable weapons for that long range play. For this, you'll want to use the Agency Suppressor, Task Force Barrel, Axial Arms 3x Optic, 60 round mag, and the Field Agent Foregrip. You're really kind of going heavy on that recoil control, but you do end up getting a nice gameplay feel out of it. Very similarly here, and honestly in terms of builds, almost identical, but just the names change on some of the attachments, is the AK-47 that's next. Now, the difference with the AK-47 and the XM4 is the fact that the AK-47 has a little bit more bounce, it's a little bit more recoil, but it packs a little bit more punch ever so slightly in that damage per shot category. So it's something that if you want to do a little more damage over distance, kill maybe a little bit faster, the AK-47 is probably the way to go, but you'll have to consciously focus on that recoil a little bit more. For this, I'd recommend the GRU Suppressor, Spetsnaz RPK Barrel, Axial Arms 3x Optic, Spetsnaz Grip, and the 45 or 60 round magazine. It really comes down to which one you want in terms of most of the engagements you'll come up against. The ADS penalty is very minimal. It's like 2 to 3 frames, I think, overall, which is something you could notice, but you might not entirely. And then finally, to round out some stuff that we've talked about here before, just kind of keeping with the theme of these 2 weapons, is the Vargo 52. And I say keeping with this theme because honestly, the Vargo is kind of a hybrid between both of them, but kind of a busted hybrid in my opinion. You'll see things have counterbalancing attributes like more recoil with more damage or more handling with less damage, but the Vargo's kind of the best of the AK-47 and the XM4, so long as you don't mind a slower ADS time. The Vargo 52 has minimal recoil and has comparable damage to the AK-47, meaning more than the XM4. So for me, this is always my choice of the 3. Again, you just want to make sure you have a little more time on your engagements because you will have a slower ADS time. For this, again, classic, you could probably say with me, the GRU Suppressor, Task Force Barrel, Axial Arms 3x Optic, Spetsnaz 60 round magazine, and the Spetsnaz Grip. Now, moving away from this here, if you want something outside of what we already talked about before, very similar in relation to build. Again, Cold War weapons are very monotonous, but they still have a great place in the meta currently, the C58. And the C58 is a weapon that I've had a blast with as of recently, and honestly is still a phenomenal choice, though it may be a little bit situationally dwarfed by the XM4, AK-47, or Vargo just because of their prominence in the meta as of lately. The C58 is something that again has kind of that trade-off where you get a little bit more damage per shot, but the fire rate is slower by comparison. So for this, I'd recommend the Agency Suppressor, Task Force Barrel, Axial Arms 3x Optic. Who would have guessed it? The Field Agent foregrip and the 55-round drum mag. You're going to have a little bit more bounce just because there is a little bit more in terms of that damage per shot, but it is totally manageable, and if you can manage it, it is absolutely up there. Now, let's break away from some of these Cold War weapons. Let's break away from some of the monotony of the same builds over and over again. Let's talk about the PKM, because the PKM actually has a second best long-range TTK, and it is something that has a ton of ammo to work with, meaning that if you have at a distance that 1v4, you are absolutely going to be able to win this with relative ease. Up close and personal, I wouldn't take the PKM as my first choice. Swap to a secondary or an SMG of some kind if you're in close proximity with players, but if they're at 50 meters or so, you can absolutely pick these guys off with relative ease. So for this build, I'd highly recommend the Monolithic Suppressor, the Extended Barrel, the Tac Laser, the VLK 3x Optic, and the Snatch Grip. Now, this is something that you don't have to throw on a magazine because you do have, by default, 100 rounds in your magazine, but you also want to make sure that you are controlling the weapon because it's LMG, has more damage, and as a result, more recoil, but you also want to make sure you prioritize that ADS speed, otherwise you're going to have a very slow weapon. For this, I choose the Extended Barrel for that additional damage range, bullet velocity, and recoil control. You sacrifice a little bit in terms of that ADS speed, but you gain it back by using the Tac Laser as well as the Snatch Grip. But the Snatch Grip is kind of that dual benefit here because it adds recoil control plus ADS speed. You only sacrifice movement speed in that regard, but if you're running around the map, I'd highly recommend switching to that secondary or that sidearm. So that's something that is a phenomenal build and is one that if you want to break away from some of the monotony of what we talked about before, highly recommend the PKM. The Bruin is actually kind of the same here in regards to breaking up the monotony, but still having a great amount of potential to end up securing kills. Now, the Bruin is one that we've talked about here before. If you guys have been on the channel during the Modern Warfare days, this is something that may seem familiar. For this, I'd highly recommend the Monolithic Suppressor, the XRK Summit Barrel, the Tac Laser. The optic really comes down to your personal preference. I'd say if you end up having the blue dot reticle, run the Combat Hollow Sight. If not, run the 3x Optic because you end up getting a little bit more pinpoint precision. The base Hollow Sight's optic, not a huge fan of, and then the 60-round magazine is what you also want to run as well. That 60-round makes the world of a difference in terms of handling and mobility. You get better ADS speed, sprint to fire speed, and movement speed because you don't have to reload an entire box magazine. Add that in with the damage range, bullet velocity, and recoil control of the Summit Barrel, and that Mono Suppressor's damage range, you got a great weapon that back in the day was absolutely the main meta. Now, outside of that, we're going to talk about some other weapons here rounding into our second half of the builds. For this, we're jumping back to an older school Modern Warfare meta, but honestly, this thing is phenomenal still. I played with it basically all last night, and grabbing footage of a lot of the weapons you'll see here in this video as well, this was still by and far one of my favorites to use. So I think I'll definitely be jumping back to this more so you might see this here in upcoming videos as well a little further. That being the CR56 AMAX, the absolute king back in Modern Warfare's days, but for this, the Monolithic Suppressor, XRK Zodiac Barrel, the VLK 3x Optic, the Commando foregrip, or the Merc foregrip if you want some additional recoil control, which isn't too terrible, but you do sacrifice some ADS speed if you are looking for that, and the 45-round magazine. Unfortunately, that's the most you can get out of it, but that is still one of my go-to Modern Warfare builds for all of Warzone. So still a ton of fun to play around with. Highly recommend it. Next, I'd highly recommend the EM2. It might seem a bit unconventional, and again, coming back to some Black Ops Cold War weaponry, the difference here with this is that unlike the C58, which at the time was probably the most comparable weapon to this ends up having more bounce in your shots, but has a lethal damage way more than the C58 if you can land your shots. It's a more higher skilled weapon in terms of that classification of weapons. I'd say this is probably on the end of that scale between the XM4, AK-47, Vargo, C58, and EM2, but if you can manage it, it's definitely worthwhile. The build, very familiar: Agency Suppressor, Task Force Barrel, Axial Arms 3x Optic, Field Agent foregrip, and the 50-round magazine. Unfortunately, you can't get a 60, so you're gonna have to make do with 50, but still incredibly manageable. Another Cold War weapon coming back to it, and honestly, you can probably see that we have a lot of options within the Cold War meta in particular that still stand the test of time. The FARA is one that's interesting to me. It doesn't have the best TTK at range anymore. It was the main meta for the season it was introduced, but since then it's been kind of viable, competitive even, but maybe not the best option here. For this, I'd run the GRU Suppressor, Spetsnaz RPK Barrel. Tiger Team Spotlight is where we see some differential here. Just for me personally, I like that additional movement speed, though you can if you want additional recoil control. That Spetsnaz grip is still there, but I think the Farah actually has a very easy to control recoil pattern as is, so you might be better off taking something that adds to some mobility. But then the Axial Arms 3x optic and the Spetsnaz 60 round magazine. That is one that, again, is kind of a deviation here if you want to break away and just play around with something that you might not have for quite some time, but still highly recommend it. And finally, the last one we'll talk about here, rounding out this top 10 for the long range, is one that we are familiar with, so we're just going to breeze past it, that being the Bren. Now, this is one that is still there. I don't know if it will be in the next couple of weeks here with Season 3. There is the promise of that long-range meta shift with snipers in particular, but also some of the regular ranged weapons may look to be changed as well. The Bren, by name, has been mentioned that it will have a nerf here coming to it, so for the time being, this is still there, but maybe not so much for the foreseeable future. For this, the MX Silencer, Queen 705 Royal Barrel. I like the 36x optic for that additional zoom, the Hawkinson stock, the M1941 hand stop, the Sakura 40 round magazine, lengthened, polymer grip, tight grip, and fully loaded. And of course, that is one we're all familiar with here. It's been the dominant Vanguard meta for a couple of months now at this point. That said, that's my pick for the top 10 here in terms of that long range meta play. But coming back to what we said at the very beginning, the nice part about this is that it's not set in stone. 1 to 10, these are not the only ones you can use. There's still plenty of honorable mentions that I would say can absolutely make their way in on any given day, and depending on the player. The Automaton is very easy to control, a bit of bounce, but the TTK just a bit more on that slower side, so I'd put it just on the outside looking in. The Cooper's kind of the same way. The M13 is still a viable option. The MG42, the RPD. There's plenty of weapons that once you get out to 30 to 40 to 50 meters plus, you have phenomenal options with. Of course, you still have that Swiss K31 and the Car as your viable sniper metas right now, though those again are on the chopping block for Season 3. But that said, that is where we're going to wrap it up. I would love to get your thoughts and feedback down there in the comment section down below. What are your preferred top 10 loadouts here for your long range plays? Is there anything in particular we may have missed, or anything that you guys are dead set on that is your favorite? Feel free to drop your thoughts down below. But if you enjoyed the video, do me a favor and drop a like on it. And if you're new to the channel, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss a single thing regarding all things Warzone, loadouts, tips and tricks, Season 3 content here coming in the next few days. We got you covered with all of this. If you guys are at all interested, I'd love to have you in the community. But said, thanks so much for watching. My name is Espresso. I'll see you guys later. Take care and peace.